So we are very delighted to be here. We wanted to thank Professor Skorecki and colleagues for inviting us to be at this very exciting event in this beautiful city of Haifa. Right now we're going to be talking about the art of medical decision-making and why experts may disagree, and we're going to start the conversation off. So as you just heard, we are both physicians and teachers at Harvard Medical School in Boston, and in these roles we spend a lot of time working to stay up to date on the latest medical information and advances. And one thing that we have found striking is that despite the many advances that we have, the application of scientific principles to medical care and the sophisticated data analysis that's available to us, there seems to be increasing disagreement about even the most common problems, how to diagnose and treat them. And this kind of uncertainty is very unsettling, very unnerving to both doctors and patients. So why are the experts disagreeing? Why isn't there a clear right answer? And how do physicians make their recommendations and patients make their decisions about treatment in the face of this kind of controversy? That is the question that we set out to answer. Now, controversy in medicine is not new, but what is new is how medical controversy is endlessly featured in the media. So it's not just medical professionals who are dealing with these issues. All of us are directly confronted with controversy in medicine through the media. You can't pick up a magazine or a newspaper, turn on the radio or the television, and certainly you can't search the internet without finding conflicting medical information and advice. And in fact, we often read about medical controversies in the lay press even before we see them in the New England Journal or the Lancet. And because of this, patients are increasingly aware that experts disagree. And we're going to use the next few slides here just to show you some examples of that. So should everyone with an elevated cholesterol be treated with a statin? About 3 years ago, new guidelines came out to address this question in the United States, and almost immediately there was intense debate, with many experts arguing that too many people would be treated with little benefit. What blood pressure needs to be treated? The guidelines keep changing and the experts disagree. In just the last few years, the targets for blood pressure have loosened, then tightened with the recent SPRINT trial, and now loosened again. Several studies have even raised doubt about one of the most basic and long accepted approaches to the treatment of hypertension, the low-salt diet. Another controversy centers on vitamin D. Should everyone take vitamin D? And if so, how much? What is the normal level of vitamin D, and should we even be measuring levels of vitamin D? In November 2011, the Institute of Medicine in the United States put out their report on vitamin D, and you can see here the two headlines that came out on the same day. The experts quoted by the New York Times that extra vitamin D was not necessary, and in the Wall Street Journal, the experts suggested that you should triple your vitamin D intake. Now, this vitamin D controversy has not been settled. This was from last month in the New York Times, again, raising the question of whether people should be taking vitamin D, and if so, how much. So I'm sure you're all aware of the conflicting recommendations regarding cancer screening. How often should a woman have a mammogram, and do mammograms even save lives? The debate about prostate cancer and PSA screening has been everywhere. You can see up in the corner there the Family Guy. And should a healthy man have PSA screening? Well, this debate seemed to be settled in 2012 when the government panel in the United States, the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force, recommended against PSA screening. They gave it a D recommendation, you shouldn't do it. But just last month, the same panel changed their mind and revised the recommendations. And breast cancer and prostate cancer are not the only cancers creating controversy. This is about thyroid cancer. It was in the New York Times suggesting that thyroid cancer, which like prostate cancer is often very indolent but not always, is being overdiagnosed and overtreated. So every one of these issues and many more remain an active controversy in both medical journals and in the lay press. So how do physicians and patients make their decisions in the face of this kind of controversy? We didn't have a ready answer, so we began to search.
So we went back to the textbooks, and we looked at classic medical decision analysis, which is drawn from economics. And a formula is used to calculate what is the, quote, best decision. The formula was derived from Daniel Bernoulli, who was a mathematician in Holland in the 1700s. Now, Bernoulli was looking at decision-making in the marketplace. He said that the best choice is calculated by looking at the probability of a certain outcome and multiplying it by the utility or the impact that that outcome has. Now, in economics, the probability of an outcome might mean the chance of selling a certain number of products. And utility is basically the profit in dollars, euros, pounds sterling, shkalim, whatever currency you're working with. The impact on the bottom line. Now, this formula is the basis of much of economic decision analysis. And it's been imported. It's been brought into medicine. And in medicine, you can estimate the probability of an outcome. For example, consider the treatment of prostate cancer. You can look at the probability of an outcome of a side effect, like urinary incontinence. But then the question becomes, how do you put a number on the second part of the equation, on the utility, the impact that it has on your life? Now, there are three different methods that have been used in classic medical decision analysis. The first is a linear rating scale from 0 to 1. 0 means you're dead. 1, you are in perfect health. And you're supposed to look at the scale and say, well, if I had urinary incontinence after treatment of my prostate cancer, my life would be at this point between 0 and 1. Another method is called the time trade-off. How many years of life would you be willing to trade off or give up in order to avoid incontinence? And the third is the standard gamble that comes from game theory. Here you're asked to imagine that there is a magic pill, and this magic pill can completely prevent a certain outcome, like incontinence. But in a certain percentage of cases, the magic pill kills you immediately. And you're supposed to estimate what odds you would be willing to take to completely avoid a certain outcome versus the chance that you might be killed immediately. Now, recent research in cognitive psychology has shown that these three methods are all severely flawed. The problem is you cannot reliably forecast your life in the future. You can't accurately understand the impact that a certain outcome will have if you've never experienced it. Also, as this audience knows, medical conditions are not static. They're not fixed. They're dynamic. They're changing. Moreover, people adapt. So not only does the disease change, but the person changes. Despite this, these three methods are broadly used to determine what is best. They're used to calculate so-called QALYs, quality-adjusted life years, which sets priorities in the United Kingdom and have been proposed to be the basis for cost-effectiveness research in the United States as part of health reform to set priorities in our country. Now, the way this works is that healthy people are asked about how much time they would trade off or where their life is on a 0 to 1 to avoid a certain medical condition. But what happens when you actually ask the people who have that medical condition? For example, healthy people say that if you're blind, your life is at 0.5 between 0 and 1. The utility of your life is reduced by 50%. Now, I happen to have a first cousin who has been blind since birth. She was born prematurely in the 1940s, and at that time exposed to high amounts of oxygen, which destroyed her retina. My first cousin speaks 4 languages. She worked her whole life as a teacher, and she's on the board of her synagogue. She's retired now, and she volunteers in an assisted living facility, helping sight-impaired elderly people, teaching them how to use a Braille keyboard so that they can get on the internet. If you told my first cousin that her life was a 0.5 on a scale of 0 to 1, she would smack you in the face. So you see that when you speak to people who have a certain medical condition, their assessment of their own life is very, very different than what people who are healthy and have never experienced that medical condition believe. So this entire structure of medical decision-making is deeply flawed. And Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel laureate in economics, who's a cognitive scientist, recently gave an address to a medical decision-making meeting. And he said the classic paradigm of measuring utility is like measuring the ether in 19th century physics when the ether did not exist.
So we realized the textbooks were not giving us the answers that we were looking for. And we thought about Sir William Osler, one of the most famous physicians of all time who practiced in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And he made the following comment about making a challenging diagnosis. He said, listen to the patient, because if you know how to listen, he's telling you the answer. So we decided to listen to patients. We did field research in the United States. We interviewed scores of patients across the country, patients from different regions with different kinds of backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds, with different kinds of medical problems. And we asked them how they made their decisions. And while people are individual in how they make their decisions, there were also common threads that characterized their approaches to their health and medical problems when they arose. And in order to explain these common threads to you, we'd like to ask you to participate now in a thought experiment. So we'll begin by asking you a few questions. First, if you could raise your hand if you yourself have been a patient over the last year. And by patient, I mean, have you been for a checkup or a minor problem to your doctor? Have you been to the emergency room or admitted to a hospital? Any of those. So not quite everybody, but almost everybody. So now try to remember the experience yourself of being a patient and try to put yourself into the mindset of being a patient. And now imagine that you're sitting in your doctor's office and your doctor says to you that your blood pressure is too high. And that even though you've changed your life, you've dieted, you've exercised, you've tried everything that you can think of, but your blood pressure is still high. And now it's time for medication. So raise your hand if you'd like to be proactive, if you want to aim for perfect blood pressure control, and you'll do whatever it takes to get that. Okay? Now, raise your hand if you feel that your blood pressure doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, you just want the minimum amount of medication. Ooh, a lot of those. So the term we apply to the first mindset, those are the maximalists. You want to be ahead of the curve, do everything and more. The second group, that's the minimalists. Less is more.
So your doctor prescribes the blood pressure medication. And it turns out that the medication comes in two forms. One is extracted from an herb. It comes from a natural source. The other is synthesized in a laboratory. But both pills are chemically identical, and they both cost the same amount. Your doctor offers you a choice. Raise your hand if generally you prefer to get a medication from a natural source. Okay. That actually represents about 50% of the population in the United States. I don't know what the comparability is in Israel. And now raise your hand if you prefer a medication that is synthesized using the latest technology. Okay, we're at the Technion. So we call the first group individuals who have a naturalism orientation. These are people who, if the problem might be solved or amenable or approached with a, quote, natural solution, they look to that. And for certain things like control of pain, they'll look for massage or acupuncture or meditation and so on. And the second group we term having a technology orientation. These are individuals who look to technology, who look for the latest breakthrough cutting-edge treatment.
So finally, your doctor gives you the prescription for the medication that you selected, and you go ahead and fill the prescription, and now you're sitting down and you're just about to take the first pill. So raise your hand if you swallow it down, confident that you're on the right path to solving your problem of high blood pressure. Okay? Now raise your hand if you take the pill out of the bottle, stare at it for a while, pull out the package insert, look at the side effects a few times, and wonder if you should really take it. So the first group we term believers. Believers are certain that there's a good solution for their problem, and once they find it, they're ready to go for it. The other group, that's the doubters. Doubters worry that the treatment will be worse than the disease. So the terms of these mindsets came out of the many interviews that we did with patients, and these were the common threads that we found that characterized their approach to their health in general and when specific health conditions arose. And this applied not only to problems like high blood pressure or high cholesterol, but also to decisions around surgery and treatment of cancer. So it's not just patients who have these mindsets, as many of you have seen right now. Doctors have them too. So now we want to get a little personal and talk about our own medical minds. And Jerry, you can go first.
Okay, so I was raised in a family with a strong Eastern European Jewish tradition where doctors were on a pedestal. Physicians like Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin were heroes for their work with polio. Science and technology were also greatly honored. And anything that was thought to be, quote, natural was a throwback to ignorant village life in Eastern Europe. So I was raised as a believer with a technology orientation. And being a believer meant, in my family, doing everything to the maximum. The attitude was every pill, every treatment must mean better health. Now, my father, in his early 50s, had a heart attack and died. My family lived in a working class neighborhood in New York. There was no hospital nearby with an intensive care unit. There were no cardiologists. And my father may have died because he did not get intensive treatments. He may have survived, but he may have died anyway, even with a cardiologist in an ICU. But this experience reinforced my belief in intensive interventions. And that maximalist mindset extended not only to heart disease, but basically to all of medicine. And my decision to become a hematologist in the 1970s, when bone marrow transplantation was being developed, one of the most intensive treatments, was seen by me also as an opportunity to potentially save lives of people with leukemia and lymphoma who otherwise would have died. So my medical mind is that of a maximalist and a believer.
And I had a different kind of upbringing. I was the first child in my family, and when I was a baby, the doctor sat my parents down and explained to them that the new scientific way to feed a baby was every 4 hours by the clock. And my dad, who was an engineer, was very enthusiastic about applying scientific principles to child rearing. And so he constructed a very detailed chart for my mom so that she could check off all the boxes. And then he went to work. And my mom stayed home with a screaming baby. And after a while, she took matters into her own hands and decided to feed me when I was hungry, when I seemed to be hungry. And my dad came home and was appalled when he found out what had happened and said, you know, how can you not follow the advice of the doctors, the expert? And my mom had the point of view of a doubter, said, experts don't know everything. So my parents were ahead of their time with respect to a healthy lifestyle. They never smoked. They were avid exercisers. My dad got my sisters and I up early in the morning to do the Royal Canadian Air Force exercises every morning. And my mom had us eat whole wheat bread, which in the 1950s was really not very tasty. My parents have had the good fortune, by virtue of their genes and or their lifestyle, to live long and healthy lives into their 90s, and my dad still works out every day in the gym. So this kind of background has contributed to my minimalist doubter orientation. So Jerry's a maximalist and a believer, and I'm a minimalist and a doubter. And we maintain these mindsets about our own health despite training in very similar medical schools. As you heard, Jerry went to Columbia, I went to Harvard, and we trained in the very same hospital, Mass General Hospital. So why are we telling you this? We're telling you this to point out, to emphasize that doctors and experts have mindsets and that this can impact the advice that we give. But of course, when making decisions about treatment, you have to consider the evidence, the numbers, data from clinical trials. Shouldn't these numbers give you the information that you need to figure out exactly what is best?
So one of the first patients we spoke with is a woman we call Susan Powell. All the patients we talk about today with you are real, but we change their names for confidentiality. Susan Powell is in her 40s, works as a nursing assistant, and on a regular checkup with her primary care doctor was found to have an elevated cholesterol level of 240, the normal cutoff in the lab 200. This was double-checked and confirmed. Now, Susan's an active person. She walks regularly, follows a healthy diet, does not smoke, does not have hypertension, does not have diabetes. Her doctor said, Susan, you need treatment for your elevated cholesterol. You need a statin medication. This will decrease your risk of a heart attack by 30%. Now, that made an impression on Susan. She said she'd think about it, but she did not immediately go and fill her prescription. She went on the internet, and she came upon a website from the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, that has what's called a risk calculator. And a risk calculator answers a key question that every patient should ask himself or herself, regardless of their condition. And that is, what is my risk of a certain outcome without any treatment? Now, for a woman like Susan, who's in her 40s, with a cholesterol of 240, and no other risk factors, the chance that she would have a heart attack in the next 10 years is 1 in 100, 1%. Even if her cholesterol had risen to 280 and she were in her 50s, the risk of a heart attack over the next 10 years is 2%, 2 in 100. So you see how your mind plays a trick on you. When you hear that a statin medication will reduce your risk of a heart attack by 30%, it sounds to you as if your risk is 100%. But for a woman like Susan, it's really 30% of 1%. Or if she were in her 50s with an even higher cholesterol of 280, it would be 30% of 2%, which clearly has a different impact on your thinking than what she had originally heard. Now, we spoke with some people who are maximalists and believers, like a woman we call Michelle Bird. And she said, I could be that one person in 100 who will have the heart attack in the next 10 years. I'm taking the statin. But Susan was a minimalist and a doubter, and she was not convinced by the numbers.
But there's more to Susan's story than just numbers. Shortly after she was given the statin, she went to her church for a church dinner, and there she saw an acquaintance who was hobbling around looking very uncomfortable and ill. And she went over and spoke to her, and wouldn't you know it, this friend had been prescribed the very same statin medication that had just been given to Susan. And she had a side effect from that medication, the most common side effect, which is myopathy or muscle pain. As you know, stories like this have powerful effects on all of us. Cognitive scientists call this availability bias because the dramatic story stays in your mind and is readily available. And these kinds of stories can make you overestimate the likelihood or probability that the same side effect might occur in your case. So although these stories can be helpful, they can also be misleading, making something rare appear likely. So when you hear a story like this, you need to know the numbers. How common is this side effect of myopathy while taking a statin? So it turns out that the number ranges from about 1% to about 10%, depending on the type of statin, the dose, other medications, or other medical problems. Now, 10%, that might sound like a pretty big number, but now let's present or frame the information in the opposite way. Between 90 and 99% of patients will not have this side effect. And that sounds much better, although the information is the same. So when you're helping a patient make a decision, or when you are the patient yourself making the decision, it's important to flip the frame, to view the information in both the positive and the negative. You might think that framing is primarily a problem for patients, but a recent Swiss study showed that physicians are just as prone to framing and as patients are. So how do patients and physicians get numbers and other information about medical treatments? Well, one way is through advertising, pharmaceutical advertising. And a study from UCLA showed that if you watch the evening news and 2 hours of primetime television in the United States, you will see in excess of 1,000 drug advertisements. And this works out to about 16 hours, which is a lot more than most patients spend with their doctors. And these ads are effective. For every $1,000 that's spent on advertising, it's estimated that 24 new prescriptions are written. Now, drug advertisements are carefully constructed to use the power of numbers to sell the product. So let's look at how it's done. Numbers are framed in the most positive way. So for example, for a statin, it might say that it decreases your risk of a heart attack by 30%, but obviously it's not saying it's 30% of 1% or 30% of 2%. It turns out that when patients hear numbers the way they're presented in drug advertisements, a study from Dartmouth showed that they typically think the medication is 10 times more effective than it really is. But this is not just a problem with advertisements. It's also an issue when you look at the reports of clinical trials. And we're going to show you that in this slide here. So you've all seen the reports, I'm sure, about the Mediterranean diet. And this was published in the New England Journal in 2013. And this is the abstract from the paper. The authors described that patients who followed the Mediterranean diet had an adjusted hazard ratio of 0.7, which means a relative risk reduction for cardiovascular events like heart attack and stroke of about 30% by following the Mediterranean diet. And that's an impressive number that was in every report that was in the news media. So now let's look at the actual numbers. In the control group, 4.4% of the patients had a cardiovascular event. In the diet plus extra virgin olive oil group, 3.8% had a cardiovascular event. And in the diet plus nuts group, the 3.4% had a cardiovascular event. So the absolute decrease in the events was 0.6% with olive oil group and 1% of the diet plus nuts. And I think you'll all agree that if we reconfigured this abstract to say that the absolute decrease in risk with the Mediterranean diet plus nuts was 1%, you'd be less impressed than you were when you heard it was a 30% decrease in risk. So the information is correct, it's accurate, but you have to be careful when you're hearing about relative rather than absolute numbers. It has a very different impact on your thinking. But even more importantly, returning to Bernoulli, making the best choice involves not only knowing the numbers, but knowing how you value the numbers. So it turns out that there are many areas of medicine that fall into a gray zone, where we really don't have the information we need to say what is clearly best for everyone. And I'll give you an example from my own practice. As an endocrinologist, one of the most common things that we see are thyroid nodules. And most of these lumps in the thyroid, and most of these are benign, but some of them are malignant. And in order to evaluate them, we usually do an ultrasound and then a needle biopsy. But sometimes the biopsies don't give us a definitive answer. Sometimes, even after multiple biopsies, you can't even get enough cells. So I had a patient recently who was in this situation. She had been to each of the three major teaching hospitals at Harvard for a large thyroid nodule that was biopsied 3 times, once at each hospital, couldn't get enough cells. So the ultrasound was kind of an indeterminate ultrasound, not clearly worrisome, but not clearly benign either. So what are the numbers? In this situation, the risk of malignancy is around 10% or less. So she said to me, "What would you do?" Now, what would you do? That's a question we get asked all the time as physicians. So what would you do for your mother? What would you do for your sister? What would you do for yourself? So I said, looking at these numbers, for me, I would watch and wait. But my husband, Jerry, would have had would have had surgery yesterday, worried about cancer. So we're both looking at the same numbers, but we have different medical mindsets. We're not suggesting that the doctor and the patient need to have the same medical mindset. Sometimes being challenged helps you to make a better decision. But doctors need to understand the patient's mindset, and the patient needs to understand that the doctor has a mindset too.
So let's return to the subject of controversies in medicine. All of us look to experts to help guide us. Who are these experts? Now, insurance companies and major health organizations are now marketing themselves as having the experts who will look at the data and guide your medical decision. This is an advertisement from United Healthcare in the United States. This is the largest insurance company in our country. It's probably comparable here to various other kinds of managed plans. And you'll see there's a woman who's very athletic, and she's a jogger, and there's a story that in the past she injured her knee, she kept running, and now it's worse. And the insurance company says, you would like to know that you're choosing the right doctor. So they're saying, we have the experts to tell you who the doctor should be. You want to know you're choosing the right procedure. We have the experts who will tell you what kind of operation to have. And then it says, you would like to know you will have the right outcome. I call this the Donald Trump promise. This is impossible. It's shakran. It's a lie. You can't guarantee anyone, regardless whether it's a pill, a medication, or a surgery in the hands of the best physician, the best surgeon, that you will have the right outcome, meaning benefit without any risk or downside or side effects of pain and bleeding and so on. So let's return to the controversies that we talked about earlier. Mammograms and PSA. A review article recently looked at the recommendations around mammograms. 4 different expert committees came up with 4 different recommendations about what age a woman should begin to have a mammogram and how often. PSA testing, the recommendations primarily are based on 2 randomized trials in 2009. The American trial had a PSA screen group and a control group. The problem was that in the control group, the men received, quote, usual care, and more than half of the control group actually had PSA screening. The American study showed no difference in terms of mortality, death as the outcome. The European study did show a benefit, but the problem with that study is that from center to center within Europe, there were no uniform criteria about what PSA level should lead to a biopsy and how often to do the PSA testing. 3 different expert committees looked at the same data and came up with 3 different opinions. In the United States, the government panel said no PSA screening initially. The oncology group said that if a man is expected to live 10 years or more, he should consider PSA. And the American Urological Society said if a man is 55 to 69, he should talk to his doctor about it. 3 different committees, 3 different opinions.
So why do these, So why do these expert committees disagree? We believe that they disagree largely because they reflect different mindsets. With regard to mammograms and PSA screening, the United States Preventative Services Task Force represents a minimalist doubter point of view. Less is more. And this has become an increasingly popular point of view, in part due to the rising costs of providing health care. Other professional societies represent a maximalist believer point of view. But none of these recommendations are strictly objective. Everyone is looking at the same data, the same studies, but they value the information differently due to different mindsets.
So we're going to conclude by saying that we believe there's a three-step process when you're making a medical decision and helping guide a patient or for yourself. The first is to consider your own mindset, your own approach in general. Maximalist, minimalist, believer, doubter, naturalism, technology orientation. We found this kind of language extremely helpful in terms of communicating with our patients. The second, numbers. To look at those clinical trials that Dr. Drazen talked about and to try to see where that patient fits in the larger cohorts. Individualize it. And finally, stories. Now, in evidence-based medicine, scientific thinking, stories are not very popular. But Daniel Gilbert, who's a professor at Harvard of cognitive psychology, showed in a paper in Science that the best way to try to understand that second part of Bernoulli, the utility, the impact that a certain condition might have on your life, is to talk to other people and hear their stories in terms of how they adapted and how they experienced it. So we hope that the language we propose today is helpful to facilitate shared decision-making, that together patients and doctors can determine what is best by best for that particular individual with preferences and values. Thank you.